what do you see as the most concerning criminal justice issue today?
So the most concerning issue in this country, in terms of criminal legal system, is that mass incarceration at a scale that no other country has. The US has 5% of the world's population, but 20% of the incarcerated population of the world. And the huge inequities, the racial injustice, the fact that communities of color and poorer Americans are those who are incarcerated. So the biggest issues are issues around bail reform. We need to do better so that people aren't going to jail simply because they can't afford to bail themselves out. We need to think about diversion programs so that people who are suffering from mental illness or from substance misuse are not being put in jails. Jails are not healthy places. And having worked at the New York City Health Department, where we oversaw the health of prisoners in Rikers Island, I know how horrible the conditions are. So this is an issue that I feel strongly about, and I'm so glad that activists have called for, during COVID, the release of people who do not pose a threat, and that a lot of states have followed and released people. And I hope that that's going to be one silver lining, that we will have a conversation around reform of this criminal justice system.
So I think there's a couple ways to attack this question. First is what happens before people get into prison, and then what happens when they're in jail and prison. Before, the antidote to criminal justice reform is education and youth engagement. We need to get into the communities and not be reactive. We need our police, we need our community crisis intervention teams, our probate courts, our medical teams, all engaging our younger generations to talk about what this looks like, to keep them out of jail, to make sure that they know we're for them and we want them to succeed. And we need to decriminalize, I said it before and I'll say it again, poverty, that's at the big part of this, and mental health and substance use disorders, so they're not going in. But once you are in jail, we need to work on three things: cutting down on recidivism, making sure that we are rehabilitating, and giving people the skills and training when they leave. So what do I mean by that? We can't just let people leave jail who then don't have the right housing, don't have transportation, don't have support around them to succeed in life, because they're going to come right back in. Secondly, if they are and have substance use disorder, then we need to treat that while they're in jail and prison, so when they come out, they have a better chance to succeed. And finally, we need to educate them, give them the skills and training to get affordable jobs that allow them to at least have a living standard that's acceptable, so they're not going to be back in prison later on.
I think the challenge that stays with us is that kids like me who grew up in Newton were not arrested, did not have their futures constrained by doing the things that kids who grew up in different zip codes were arrested for. We've got to level the playing field and ensure that we are not criminalizing recreational drug use, that we are descheduling marijuana at the federal level. We do not need to be locking up people for recreational drug use. We do not need to be ruining futures for nonviolent crimes. And I think that we need to really confront the fact that our drug laws have been in their very core racist.
The disproportionate number of persons of color who are getting convicted of crimes, many of them drug related, which gets back to the opioid epidemic thing, why drugs should be all crime-free.
Well, this is a scandal. I mean, we have the highest rate of incarceration of any country in the world per capita. We have, and it's more Black and brown people than anyone else. We need to end mandatory minimum sentences. We need to end private prisons. I mean, that's awful that people are actually making money off of locking people up. We need to make sure that we decriminalize drug offenses. People are thrown in. We need to end 3 strikes and you're out. We need to abolish the death penalty. We need to let formerly incarcerated people vote. And we need to restore Pell Grants so that people can actually educate themselves, so that when they get out of prison, they can re-enter society with a productive path. We don't have a criminal justice system. We have a retribution system that's full of injustice. And this is something that we have to confront. Again, your generation understands this. We should stop making money off of prisons. We need to move to a restorative justice system. Brian Stevenson, who's a good friend of mine, has been the leader on this. And we have to understand that this is about all of us. It is not a positive thing for America to have the highest rate of incarceration of any country in the world. And it doesn't have to be this way. In 1974, it was much less. We can deal with this if we change our policies.
We could be here for a while. But look, I think a lot of it gets back to, we're seeing the heartbreaking consequences of the failures of the criminal justice system right now, today, at this moment in Minnesota and in other communities across the country. I think it's been said a lot and deserves to be said again. We have 5% of the world's population, and we have 25% of the world's prisoners. That's unacceptable. That is unacceptable, particularly when you look at the demographics of who those prisoners are and the destruction in Black and brown communities across the country that we've seen as a result of mass incarceration. And so, this is something that I worked on in the Attorney General's office. I think I was honored to go on a restorative justice retreat to a prison, which is actually in the 4th Congressional District at Norfolk. And, restorative justice brought together, prosecutors, judges, survivors, as well as incarcerated people to have a conversation, to sit down and talk about, what they see as challenges and barriers in the criminal justice system, because in a law enforcement office, I and Attorney General Healy and others felt like anybody who's involved in the criminal justice system needs to spend some time in a prison, needs to talk to people who are incarcerated, needs to understand what's gone wrong. And I think it was really clear. The system was not working for anyone. And I think that that's an important lesson. The judges didn't like it. The prosecutors didn't like it. The families of the survivors and families of those lost didn't like it. And people who were incarcerated, all of them told stories about trauma that they themselves had experienced in their neighborhoods well before they had been incarcerated. I worked on this as well when I was in law school. I worked with the Office of Returning Citizen Affairs in Washington, D.C. to try to figure out why folks coming back from prisons did not feel supported, did not have the education they needed inside, and didn't have the tools they needed when they got out to, find safe and stable housing, to be able to get a job, to be able to get back into the workforce. It's just a tragedy, is what it is. It's a stain on our country, and it's something that we need to work together on. I think the good news is that there are people like District Attorney Rachel Rollins in Boston, as well as in a number of other cities around the country, who are trying to address a simple fact, which is that we've criminalized poverty, is what we've done in this country. There are a lot of people who are in jail right now because of nonviolent, low-level drug offenses that should not be in jail. There are people who are in jail right now because they couldn't afford to pay bail. That's a debtor's prison. That's illegal. That violates the Constitution. And I just think that we need to attack this as the crisis with the urgency that it deserves. I'm glad that we passed criminal justice reform in Massachusetts, but we need to do this federally, and we need to be much more aggressive about it.
There is no one, because it is such a systemic issue. I mean, to identify one single thing, I fear would minimize the really important conversation that we need to have about the gross systemic inequities that have led to the problems. Actually, a great community activist told me not to say our criminal justice system, it's our criminal legal system, because justice is very much missing from the system that we have right now for so many people. There are a bunch of things that I think we need to do. Let's be clear that in the short term, if you are not a threat to society and you are currently incarcerated as we deal with this COVID-19 crisis, we need to make sure that we're taking every consideration to reunite people with their families and get them out of a situation where this virus, can, and in some cases is, spreading like wildfire. I think that we need to legalize cannabis, and anyone who is has a conviction on their record or is currently incarcerated for that, that should be erased. I think that we need to abolish the death penalty, which thankfully we don't have in Massachusetts, but it is a problem and disproportionately impacts people of color, low-income communities across the country. We need to end for-profit prisons, for crying out loud. I mean, the idea that someone can make a profit off of someone being incarcerated is just horrifying to me. We need to end cash bail. We need to make sure that we're centering justice in the pretrial process. We need to hold law enforcement accountable. We've seen just in the past few weeks additional examples, although we know that just because it's not captured on camera and makes the national news doesn't mean it's not happening. And then we need to address the many, many systemic inequalities that are contributing to the cradle to prison pipeline that we are seeing across the country. Inequities around housing, wages, education, food insecurity. I mean, we could go on and on and on. So I know your question was for me to identify one thing, but I cannot frame it like that when this is an issue that is so broad, so deep, and we have to look at it as whole cloth.
I think that racist policies that go back centuries are the most concerning. I think that the fact that somebody can be going out for a jog, get shot, or be killed, and then the killers can just get away with it for two months or more, nobody's searching for them. That's very concerning to me. I think it's concerning to me that that a Black mother sends her child to go to the grocery store and the child never comes back. I think it's concerning to me that people think of gun violence in a way that doesn't center racial justice. I think it's concerning to me as a mother to talk to my child or train her on how to be safe if her school gets hijacked or if the mosque gets hijacked or the synagogue. And I think that the most concerning part is that our government is not diverse. Our government does not reflect the body of our people. It doesn't reflect, tell me how many, how many people of color we have in Congress, and I would tell you why our policies are lacking of racial justice. And we don't have a criminal justice system. We have a criminal injustice system.
Well, this is a very difficult question to answer because there are a number of issues that are concerning about our criminal justice system. We have to admit to ourselves that that we are the leader in the world in terms of mass incarceration. And we also have to admit to ourselves that when you look at how our laws are applied, that they are applied very unevenly. So, whether the most important thing is to reduce the likelihood that people are detained because they don't have money to pay for a cash bail, or whether it's, the privatizations of prisons, which have created all sorts of incentives that are really a detriment to our community and to our people. But really, I think the most important thing, if I had to pick one, is really to reform mandatory sentencing. I think we need to give our judges, our court systems, more discretion before they sentence people to jail. Far too often we see people for relatively minor offenses and nonviolent offenses sentenced to prison, and really, frankly, to a lifetime of challenge and reduce the opportunity for them for their entire life, even if they're rehabilitated from a perspective of the system. And this is something, again, that inordinately impacts people from low-income backgrounds and people of color and other groups that are marginalized in our society. And I think that this is probably the most important thing to address, and is sort of a legacy of our war on drugs that was in many ways very misguided.
Can I just say all the above? I mean, all of it. I mean, from the birth to the death chamber, right? There's no really good part of that entire pipeline. We have a system that I think because we are so focused on creating a society that makes money for corporations, that we have inherently created a system that is systemically racist. And so you have a perpetuation of trauma that's passed down from one generation to another, where African Americans, Latinos, and Latinx, excuse me, and other people of color are held into poverty because they don't have the stable and emotionally stable homes that they need. I think the number one concern that I have regarding the social justice system is really, frankly, I have to be honest, is frankly giving parents the ability to create emotionally stable homes. I think the number one predictor of incarceration to start with is whether or not you had adverse childhood experiences. That's the number one thing to address this systemic racism. And so if we can get paid family leave, that's actually meaningful, not just 12 weeks like we currently have in Massachusetts. If we have universal childcare, so parents don't have to pay $35,000 a year, which, by the way, no one in poverty can afford, that would allow parents to go back to work and create stable places for their kids. And it also just means universal health care and any number of policies to help parents take the weight of the economy off of their shoulders and actually create stable homes.
As a former assistant district attorney, I have had a front row seat on this issue and have seen what happens to people who have been left behind by their communities. And poverty, discrimination, and racism, if we addressed these in other ways systematically in this country, we wouldn't be doing so in a criminal court. By the time we're seeing them in the courtroom, we have failed them. And my experiences have informed not just the urgency of criminal justice reform, but so many of the other major underlying systematic issues in this country. And making sure that we are investing in the criminal justice system in the opportunities that those we see there need to turn their life around, like mental health and social services and access to job training, not incarceration, are the reforms that I want to see.